Today's Technique Tuesday video examines the basic circular yoke sweater style. This is the 5th sweater style in a series on basic sweater styles. Today, we'll look at the various approaches to how circular yokes are constructed, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of this sweater style. I'll also provide resources for learning more about how to design a sweater using circular yoke construction. Like other sweater constructions, it can be worked bottom up or it can be worked top down. The construction of the sweater between the hems and the underarms is the same for all sweaters, and they can be knit flat and then seamed, or they can be knit seamlessly in the round. What defines this sweater as a circular yoke is the way the shaping is done between the underarm and the neck. Raglans are also a type of yoke construction, and we saw in the last episode in this series that the shaping in raglans is done along 4 seam lines with an increase and decrease done on either side of each of the seam lines every other round in order to shape the upper part of the body. A circular yoke is shaped differently. It has fewer rounds of shaping with many more increases or decreases per round than you'd see in a raglan, and the shaping is distributed evenly across all of the stitches in a shaping round. I knit this quarter scale example using a bottom-up construction. I knit each of the sleeves and the body in the round up to the armholes. When I got to the armholes, I placed stitches on hold, the same number of stitches on both the sleeve and the underarm in order to provide some horizontal depth to the underarm. Then I could join all of the parts together. I could work across a sleeve, then across the body, across the second sleeve, across the back of the body, in order to have all of the stitches for the upper body on the needles at the same time. Then the shaping begins, and it gets faster and faster as we approach the neck. Once the neck is complete, then I could return to the underarm and I could graft the stitches together. So you can see this underarm has been grafted and it's shut, and this one has not yet. Top-down construction either begins with the neck ribbing or with a provisional cast on in order to start the actual body right away, and then the ribbing would be done later. Increases are worked right away, and increase rounds are worked until about the halfway point of the yoke. Once you get down to the underarms, that's when you separate off the sleeve stitches from the body. This quarter scale raglan sweater was worked top down using that process. So once I got to the place where the sleeves were, I could put those sleeve stitches on hold, and then I could work the body in the round, and I would cast on stitches along to create the depth for the body in a top-down construction. And then once I was done with the body, I'd come back to the sleeves, put the stitches on the needle, and then I would pick up stitches along that cast-on edge of the body in order to get the full circumference of the sleeves before knitting down to the cuff. So there's 2 general approaches for how the shaping can be done in a circular yoke construction. One is the idea of concentric circle decreases, and the other is the idea of using wedges. The concentric circle approach is typically used when the stitch patterns you're using are horizontal bands. So you might be using stranded color work, or you might be using a texture stitch pattern, or you might just be doing what I'm doing here in working with plain solid color stockinette. But I'm working with a complete sort of rectangular band that just wraps around the entire body. And so what you do is between each of the horizontal bands of stitch patterns, you would have at least 1 round of plain stockinette where you could work the decreases. The wedge approach is for use with vertical panels. And so these vertical panels are in the shape of a wedge, so kind of like the way a pie would work. So you'd have the stitch pattern would be worked within this wedge shape right here, and this wedge would be repeated a number of times for the entire round. So you'd have this number of repeats for the entire depth of the yoke. For either method, the typical approach would be to limit the shaping to the upper half of the yoke. And the reason for that is that the body doesn't change much in circumference between the underarm and about the halfway point of the yoke depth. The majority of your body change is happening as you round the corner of your shoulders and head toward the neck. So most of the shaping will be in this top half of the yoke. Now there are exceptions and there are other ways that this can be done, but that's the typical approach, is to keep the shaping in the top half of the yoke. For the example that I have here where I'm using the concentric circles, I worked bottom up, and when I got to the halfway point of the yoke, I eliminated 25% of the stitches. Then when I got to the 3/4 point in the yoke, I eliminated 1/3 of the stitches that remained. Then when I get to the top of the neck, then I'd eliminate 40% of the stitches that were remaining. If you're doing a yoke construction, again, you would start the decreases at about the halfway point. You would do the decreases more frequently, but you would do fewer decreases in a particular round, and that would make the decreasing more gradual. With the concentric circle example, sometimes you can get some puckering, particularly if you have to reduce a large number of stitches. The general starting point for a sweater would be deciding what it is you wanted the circumference to be around the chest. The sleeves up around the bicep would be 35% of whatever that circumference was. And then the neck would end up being about 40 to 45% of whatever this circumference was. Once you join the sleeves to the body and you've taken those underarm stitches off on hold, you'll be left with about 138% of whatever it was you started with down here. So I'm going to start with a sweater that is 40 inches in circumference, so that's 100 centimeters, 40 inches or 100 centimeters. And I'm going to be working with worsted weight yarn, which is worked at 20 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So that's 5 stitches per inch. That is going to give us our starting point. So we have a 40-inch circumference sweater at 5 stitches per inch. That means the body will be 200 stitches in circumference. The bicep of each sleeve is going to be 35% of that. So each sleeve around the bicep is going to have 70 stitches. And there's going to be 2 of them. So at the underarm, we need to remove a couple of inches worth of stitches, somewhere usually between 2 and 4 inches. I am going to place 14 stitches on waste yarn at the underarms of each side of the body, but also on the sleeves. So underarm, 14 stitches times 2. So those are going to be removed from the total. When I join in the round, when I work across the sleeve and then join to the body, I'm going to work a decrease. I'm going to work the last stitch of the sleeve together with the first stitch of the body. That will help tighten up the gap right there. So that means there's going to be 4 decreases. So let's look at what the total number of stitches is that we're going to have on our needles. We're going to have 340 stitches from the sleeve and the body, and then we're going to remove 56 stitches, and then we're going to remove another 4 stitches. So that's going to leave us with 280 stitches on the needle when we're done joining the entire thing in the round. We're going to have 280 stitches on the needle. So the depth of the yoke is going to be about half of the width. So the circumference of this is 40, which means that the width is 20, which means that the yoke would be somewhere between 8 and 10 inches deep. These days people are going for shallower yokes. Other times people might want a deeper yoke. So we're going to say that we're going to have a depth of, we're going to have a yoke that is 8 inches deep. And if we are working with worsted weight yarn at 5 stitches per inch, that means we probably are working at 7 rows per inch. So we are going to have a yoke that is 56 rows deep. If we look back at this little sweater sample, we're going to work half of the yoke just with the stitches we have on the needle. We're not going to work any decreases. And then we're going to work that first decrease round. We're going to eliminate 25% of the stitches. And that's going to be halfway up. So that means on row 28, which is half the depth of the yoke, we're going to eliminate 25% of the stitches. And we do that by working a knit two together. So there were 4 stitches and we've eliminated one of them. And in this case, that's going to be 70 stitches. And so now we're going to have 210 remaining. This first row was at the halfway point. The second one is at the 3/4 point. So we are now on row 42, which is at 3/4 of the depth, and we're going to eliminate 33%. So we're going to eliminate 1 stitch out of every 3. So we're going to knit 1, knit 2 together. And that again is going to be an elimination of 70 stitches. So now we have 140. The final round is going to be at the very top of the body right before we switch to working the ribbing. This is round 56. We're at the full yoke depth and we're going to eliminate 40% of the stitches. And we do that by eliminating 2 stitches out of every 5. So we're going to knit 1, knit 2 together, knit 2 together. That's going to eliminate 56 stitches, and that's going to leave us with 84 stitches for the neck. So when we looked at this original thing and we looked at what the neck was going to end up, we went with 40 to 45% of the stitches, of the original amount of stitches. So if we had 200, then that would be somewhere between 80 to 90 stitches is what we would need at the top. And what we're ending up with is 84. So this works out on paper because I'm working in solid color stockinette. But when you're working with stitch patterns, you might need to fudge up or fudge down a little bit. You might need to decrease a few more or decrease a few less in order to end up with the stitch count that you need in order to work the horizontal band in the next section. Circular yoke construction has the same issues with the neck that a raglan that is worked entirely in the round will have, and that is that the front and the back match each other exactly. And the problem is that the back of your neck sits up here while the front of your neck sits a few inches lower. So when the sweater is exactly the same in the front and the back, that can cause the back to pull up a little bit, which means the back of the sweater is going to pull up as well. So what you can do in order to increase the actual length of the back so that it will sit evenly around the bottom of the hem is to work some short rows that extend from just in front of the sleeves around to just in front of the other sleeve. And you can work a few rows at the base of the yoke if you're working bottom up right after you join. And you could also do some at the base of the neck. Some people will do them at both places and some people will confine them to one place or another. The advantage to this type of sweater construction is that you can get some really stunning results with these stitch patterns that wrap around the uninterrupted. There's no seams or seam lines getting in the way with the stitch patterns that are encircling the entire yoke. The disadvantage of not having any seams or seam lines is that you don't have any structural support that a shoulder seam would provide to hold up the weight of the sweater. So this sweater can stretch in every direction. So typically what you'd want to do with this kind of a sweater style is use a lighter weight yarn, like a fingering weight or a sport weight. You also would want to think about using a yarn that is sort of self-supporting and it has its own internal structure. So yarns that are quite sticky, like Shetland wools or Icelandic wools, tend to be good for this type of construction because they just are able to hold themselves up. One of the real disadvantages to this type of construction, if you are working from a published pattern, is that not only is stitch gauge really important in order to give you the correct circumference, but you are really beholden to the number of rounds that need to be worked for the yoke. So if your row gauge is off, your yoke is going to end up being too deep or too shallow. With a raglan construction, you could vary the shaping rate a little bit in order to still hit your target yoke depth, but that is going to be a lot more difficult with this type of sweater construction. If you're designing something yourself, you're starting with the measurements you want and you are starting with the gauge that you're getting, you can really customize the entire thing in order to work within the parameters that you need in order to get a good fitting sweater. So I have a few resources to share with you. One is just this pattern leaflet from Schoolhouse Press. It's pattern number 39. You can buy it as a PDF download from Schoolhouse Press. It has 4 different construction methods that use yoke styles, and one of them includes the circular yoke sweater. Knitting in the Old Way has all sorts of traditional sweater constructions in here, including several different ways of doing yoke constructions. And Bud has 2 different books that are good for knitters. These books include actual patterns for sweaters, but also include instructions for how to create your own sweater of any dimension, from a child's size 4 up to a men's size extra large, I believe, using any gauge from 3 stitches per inch up to 7 stitches per inch. So you get the basic like stockinette formula, but then she also provides you with examples of different stitch patterns. All of the sweaters in here are bottom up, and so therefore the yoke construction is as well. These are all top-down constructions, and therefore the yoke style would be top-down as well. This is Amy Herzog's Ultimate Sweater Book. This, I think, is a really excellent way of learning sweater construction. She's got yoke styles, but other styles as well. So she explains how to figure out what dimensions you actually want. So she kind of walks you through that whole process. She really likes the idea of all of the shaping being in the top half of the yoke, whether you are using concentric circles or you are using the wedge style. I find this a very readable and understandable book, and she also includes actual design patterns as well as just information for how you would design something yourself. This book, Poems of Color, is talking about the Bohus tradition of sweaters. It was a cottage industry in Sweden that started in the 1930s. Their tradition evolved into the circular yoke construction that we talked about today. I wanted to mention that the sweater I'm wearing is not a circular yoke style. It's considered an inset yoke. The lower body and the sleeves were knit flat and seamed. There is bodice shaping to form the armholes, and the sleeves are set in with a sleeve cap. This style of sweater was a precursor to the circular yoke styles and was common in the sweaters of the 1930s and 40s. If you missed any of the previous videos on basic sweater styles and you'd like to learn more, you can find the entire playlist over here. If you have any comments or questions about this video, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.